My name is Rachel Kessler. I was 27 when my mother handed me a folded blanket, my winter coat, and a set of car keys that no longer opened anything I owned, and told me it would be easier for everyone if I didn't come back for a while. It was December 25th. There was a ham in the oven. I could smell it through the closed kitchen door while I stood in the hallway holding my whole adult life in a duffel bag I hadn't finished packing. I want to be fair about this because fairness is the thing I lost first and worked hardest to get back. My mother, Diane, was not a cruel woman by nature. She was tired. She was frightened of her own house falling apart around her, the way people get frightened when they've spent 30 years building a story about their family that doesn't match what's actually sitting at their dinner table. And what was sitting at her dinner table that year was me, unemployed since October, quieter than she liked, and apparently, in her eyes, a reminder of a failure she didn't want named out loud in front of my brother's new fiancé. "It's not permanent," she said, not looking at me, refolding a dish towel that didn't need refolding. "Just until things settle." Things had been just until things settle for 6 years. I recognized the sentence the way you recognize a scar. My brother Evan stood in the doorway to the living room, half in shadow, holding a glass of wine he wasn't old enough to be so comfortable holding. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His silence had always been louder than anyone else's shouting, precise and practiced, like he'd rehearsed exactly how much space to take up in a room without ever being blamed for taking it. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked. Not dramatically. I wasn't crying yet. I was doing math, motel prices, my sister Priya's couch, the balance on a debit card that had 4 digits before the decimal, and none of them were good ones. My mother's hand paused on the towel. For 1/2 of 1 second, something in her face flickered. Not quite regret, more like the shadow regret casts before it arrives. Then it was gone, folded up and put away like everything else in that kitchen. "You're resourceful," she said. "You'll figure it out." I want to tell you, I said something unforgettable in that moment. Some line that landed like a door slamming. I didn't. I picked up the duffel bag. I zipped my coat. I walked past the dining table where the good china was already out, where 3 extra place settings sat gleaming under the chandelier for people who were not me, and I let myself out into a cold that felt almost merciful, because at least the cold was honest about what it was. I sat in my car in the driveway for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock the whole time, the way you watch something when you can't watch anything else without falling apart. Inside, through the window, I could see the shape of my mother moving past the glass, carrying a serving dish, laughing at something. The lights were warm. The house looked from the outside, exactly like the house I grew up believing in. Then I drove. I didn't know yet that in 6 days my mother would be standing in a different doorway, mine, not hers, asking me, in a voice I had never heard her use before, to please come home. I didn't know that the story she'd tell herself about that Christmas would take longer to arrive than the truth of it did. All I knew, driving down streets lined with other people's Christmas lights, was that for the first time in years, the air outside felt cleaner than the air I'd just left behind. I ended up at Priya's apartment a little after 8. She opened the door in reindeer pajama pants and took one look at my face before she took the duffel bag out of my hands. "I'm not going to ask," she said, which was her way of asking. I told her anyway, sitting on her kitchen floor because her couch was covered in wrapping paper and her cat, Behemoth, was staring at me like he already knew the shape of this story and found it predictable. Priya listened the way she always had, since we were 19 and 22, and she was the only person at my college orientation who didn't ask what my father did for a living, because she already understood some families don't answer that question cleanly. "She actually said you're resourceful?" Priya repeated, like she needed to hear it twice to believe a mother could say that to her own daughter on Christmas. She said it like it was a compliment. Priya didn't say my mother was a bad person. She didn't say I deserved better, even though I think she believed both things. What she said was, "You're allowed to be furious and still figure out your next move. Those aren't opposites." I didn't sleep much that night. I lay on an air mattress that hissed slowly beneath me, losing air in the same unhurried way my patience with my family had leaked out over years, not in one dramatic rupture, but in 1,000 small punctures I'd told myself weren't worth fixing. I thought about the ham in the oven. I thought about the china. I thought about Evan's silence, which was the kind of silence that had never once, in 27 years, been spent defending me. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, staring at Priya's water-stained ceiling, I thought about the storage unit. It wasn't dramatic, what I remembered. It wasn't a smoking gun. It was a manila folder I'd found 8 months earlier while helping my mother declutter, her word, the garage. Financial documents. My late grandmother's estate paperwork, the one my mother had always told Evan and me had mostly gone to cover her final expenses. Except the folder held a distribution statement, and the number on it did not look like final expenses. It looked like a number that could buy a house. At the time, I hadn't understood what I was looking at. I'd asked my mother about it, gently, the way you ask about something you assume has a boring, reasonable explanation. She'd taken the folder out of my hands so fast the papers had rustled, and said, "That's old business, don't worry about that," and put it in a drawer I never saw opened again. I hadn't thought about it since. I hadn't wanted to. Some part of me, I think, had understood that pulling that thread might unravel something I wasn't ready to lose, the version of my mother I still needed to believe in some nights, more than I needed the truth. But lying on that hissing air mattress, kicked out of my own family's Christmas, so 3-place settings could stay gleaming for people more comfortable to look at than me, I found I didn't need that version of her anymore. I just needed to understand what I'd actually been living inside of. I wasn't thinking about revenge. I want to be honest about that because what came later would be easy to mistake for it, and it wasn't not really. What I wanted was smaller and, in its own way, harder to obtain. I wanted to stop being confused about my own life. I wanted, for once, to know what was actually true in that house, instead of what I'd been asked to believe was true, so everyone else's Christmas could stay comfortable. The days between Christmas and New Year's have always felt suspended to me, outside of ordinary time. The tree still up, the calendar not yet turned, everyone pretending the year hasn't really ended even though something in the light has already changed. That year, I spent those suspended days doing something I'd never done before. I started paying attention. Priya let me stay without asking when I'd leave, which was its own kind of grace I didn't thank her enough for at the time. I got a temp job doing data entry for a logistics company starting the second week of January. Nothing glamorous, but it was money, and money was oxygen. In between, I made calls. I called my grandmother's old attorney first, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Alvarez who remembered me as the granddaughter who used to fall asleep in the waiting room. He was kind and careful, and told me what he could without violating anything he shouldn't, which turned out to be more than I expected, because as it happened, I was still listed as a contingent beneficiary on paperwork my mother had apparently forgotten still existed, or hoped I had. The estate hadn't gone to final expenses. It had gone, in large part, into an account that funded exactly one thing over the following 3 years: Evan's education, his car, and, 6 months before that Christmas, the down payment on the condo he shared with his fiancée, Bridget. The condo where I now understood the extra place settings that Christmas had been set for people who mattered enough to protect. I sat with that for a long time. Not with anger. At first, with something closer to grief, the specific grief of realizing a story you told yourself to survive your own family was never quite true. I hadn't been the family disappointment because I'd made worse choices than my brother. I'd been the family disappointment because I was the one who hadn't been given the same net to fall into, and then blamed, quietly and consistently, for falling. I didn't call my mother. I didn't call Evan. I wasn't ready, and more than that, I didn't yet know what I wanted to say, or whether I wanted to say anything at all. Some nights I thought the kindest thing I could do for myself, if no one else, was to simply walk away from that whole story and build something new somewhere it couldn't reach me. But on December 30th, my mother called. I let it go to voicemail. I was at the temp job's onboarding paperwork, sitting in Priya's car in a parking lot, and I watched my mother's name light up the screen 4 times before it finally stopped and the notification appeared. I didn't listen to it right away. I sat with the phone in my lap for a long time, the way you sit with a letter you're not sure you want opened. When I finally played it, her voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Not performed. Not managing anyone. Just smaller. Rachel. It's Mom. A pause, the kind that told me she hadn't planned what came next. I need you to call me back. Something's happened with another pause. Papers shuffling somewhere on her end. Just call me back, please. I didn't call back that night. I told myself it was because I was tired, and that was even partly true. But mostly I think I needed one more day of not being the person who came running the second she used that voice, because I had spent 27 years being exactly that person, and it had never once been reciprocated. The next morning, December 31st, she called again. This time I answered. Rachel. I heard something crack, very slightly, in the second syllable of my name. Can we talk?
Can I come see you?
What happened? I asked, because I genuinely didn't know yet. I assumed, at first, that Mr. Alvarez had reached out to her, that my questions had triggered something. I was wrong, though not by much. What had happened was smaller and stranger, and, in its way, more revealing than anything I could have engineered. Evan and Bridget had gotten into a fight on the 28th, about money, about the condo, about whose name was actually on the deed, and in the middle of it, Bridget had said something about the whole family bailing you out your entire life, loudly enough that Evan's temper, which had always been quiet and cold rather than loud, had finally cracked in front of our mother for the first time in his adult life. He'd said things about the estate, about the down payment, about resentments he'd apparently been carrying that I never knew existed, aimed sideways at me. The version of me he'd built in his head, the difficult one, the one it was easier to blame for the family's strain than to examine what he himself had quietly taken. My mother had been standing in her own kitchen, the same kitchen where 6 days earlier she'd handed me a duffel bag and a blanket, and for the first time, she'd heard her golden child say, out loud and without performance, exactly what he thought their money had bought him, and exactly how little he thought I deserved of anything. I didn't know he felt that way, she told me, in a voice still not fully steady. I didn't know any of it sounded like that until I heard it out loud. I want to tell you, I felt vindicated. I did, a little. But mostly what I felt was tired, the specific tiredness of watching someone finally see something you've been trying, quietly and for years, to show them. I need to ask you something, I said, and I need you to actually answer it this time. There was a long silence. Then, okay. The estate. Grandma's estate. What actually happened to it? I heard her exhale, not defensively for once, but like something in her chest had been waiting a long time to stop holding its breath. She told me the truth on New Year's Eve, sitting in her car outside Priya's apartment building, because I hadn't let her come up, not out of cruelty, but because I needed the conversation to happen somewhere that wasn't loaded with 27 years of furniture. The truth was not a villain's confession. It rarely is in real families. It was smaller and more human and, in some ways, harder to hold than if she'd simply been cruel on purpose. She told me that after my father left, when Evan and I were 11 and 13, she had made a decision, not written down anywhere, not spoken aloud even to herself most days, that Evan was the child who needed protecting because he reminded her of my father in ways that frightened her, in ways she thought she could fix with enough investment, enough smoothing of his path. And I was the child who reminded her of herself. Steady, capable, someone she trusted to survive hardship because she had survived it. She hadn't meant it as favoritism. She'd told herself, for over a decade, that it was strategy, that I was strong enough not to need what he needed. I told myself I was being fair, she said, staring at her hands on the steering wheel. Fair didn't mean equal. It meant giving each of you what I thought you needed. But I never once asked what you actually needed, Rachel. I just decided, and then I built a story that let me feel okay about deciding. And Christmas? I asked. Was that strategy too? She flinched at that, visibly, and for a moment I almost took the question back. I didn't. Christmas was me being a coward, she said finally. Bridget's parents were coming. I didn't want them seeing. She stopped herself. Seeing what? Seeing you unemployed. Living at home. I was ashamed, and it was easier to be ashamed of you than to be ashamed of myself for how I'd let things get this way between us. Her voice broke fully, for the first time. I am so sorry. I don't expect you to just, I know sorry doesn't undo 6 days. It doesn't undo 6 years. I sat with that for a long moment. Outside, somewhere down the street, someone was already setting off early fireworks, Small cracks of light and sound against a sky that hadn't decided yet whether the year was over. I didn't forgive her in that moment. I want to be honest about that because a story that resolves too quickly isn't really honest at all. What I did was something smaller and, I think, more useful. I told her the truth back. I told her what it had felt like to be handed a blanket and car keys that didn't open anything anymore. I told her what it had felt like to sit in Mr. Alvarez's careful, kind sentences and understand, for the first time with real clarity, the shape of what I'd actually been living inside. I told her I didn't want anything from her, not money, not an apology performed for an audience, not a scene. I told her I wanted, for the first time in my adult life, to be looked at honestly, even if honestly meant she didn't always like what she saw. I don't know how to do that, she admitted. I don't think anyone ever taught me how. Then we're starting somewhere, I said. That's not nothing. I didn't move back home. I want to be clear about that because I think there's a version of the story where the neat ending is the daughter returning, the family reassembling exactly as it was, just gentler. That's not what happened, and I'm glad it isn't, because I don't think that ending would have held. What happened instead was slower. I stayed at Priya's through January while the temp job turned into something steadier. My mother and I talked, awkwardly, sometimes badly, occasionally in ways that reopened wounds neither of us expected. Every week or two, in coffee shops instead of her kitchen, on neutral ground where neither of us had 30 years of furniture arranged around old habits. Evan didn't call. I didn't expect him to, not right away. Some people need longer than others to hear themselves clearly, and I had stopped believing it was my job to wait around holding a mirror up for him. When he finally did reach out in March, it wasn't an apology so much as an awkward, half-formed gesture toward one. I've been thinking about some things, he said, which was as close to self-examination as I'd ever heard from him. I told him I appreciated it and that I needed more time than one phone call to know what I actually wanted our relationship to look like going forward. He didn't push. That, at least, was new. My mother never fully explained the estate money in dollar figures, and I never asked her to reimburse anything, though Mr. Alvarez gently pointed out, months later, that I would have had legal standing too. I didn't want a settlement. I realized somewhere in February, something closer to what I'd wanted my whole life without knowing how to name it, to be seen clearly by the people who raised me, even if seeing me clearly came late and cost something and never fully undid what came before. People sometimes ask me, when I tell this story now, whether I regret how quiet it all stayed, whether I wish I'd said something sharper in that hallway, walked out with a better line, made my mother's guilt into something louder and more satisfying than a shaking voice in a parked car on New Year's Eve. I don't. I think there's a version of justice that looks like fire, and there's a version that looks like a woman finally hearing her own voice say something true out loud for the first time in her life, and having to sit with what she hears. I got the second kind. I've come to believe it's the only kind that actually changes anything. I kept the blanket, oddly enough. It's a small, stupid detail, but it sits folded on the back of my own couch now, in the apartment I moved into that spring. My name on the lease, my own key that opens my own door. Sometimes I think about throwing it out. I never do. It reminds me of exactly how little I was offered on my way out that door, and exactly how much further I built for myself once I stopped waiting for someone else to hand it to me. My mother visits now, sometimes. She sits on my couch, under a lamp I bought myself, and she is careful with me in a way she never used to be, not performing carefulness, just present in it, like someone relearning a language she'd let go rusty. It isn't the relationship I dreamed about as a child. It's better, in a strange way, because it's the first one that's actually true. I think, in the end, what I wanted was never revenge, even in the days when I might have called it that to myself. What I wanted was for the story of my family to finally match the facts of it, for the china and the ham and the warm windows to stop being a performance I had to watch from a cold car in a driveway, and start being something I was actually honestly included in. I didn't burn anything down. I didn't need to. I only stopped agreeing to disappear quietly, and it turned out that was enough to change the whole shape of the room. Some nights, when I drive past that old house, I still do, sometimes on my way to see my mother now, on ground we've both chosen instead of ground I was simply allowed onto, I think about that Christmas night, sitting in the driveway for 11 minutes, watching the warm light move behind the glass. I don't feel the ache I used to feel remembering it. I feel something closer to distance, the good kind, the kind that comes from having actually arrived somewhere else. The cold outside that house, that night, felt honest in a way the warmth inside it hadn't been for years. I didn't know yet, sitting in that car, that I was about to spend a week learning the difference between being kept and being seen. I know it now. And some truths, once you finally see them clearly, don't need to be shouted to change everything. I didn't need to burn anything down. I just stopped disappearing quietly, and that was enough to change everything. Some truths don't need to be shouted to be heard. They just need someone brave enough to finally stop hiding them. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. New quiet justice stories drop every week. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to walk away from your own family just to finally be seen?